Hey guys, Spirit of the Lie here. In this video, we're going to look at the fun and speculative, maybe controversial topic of underrated and overrated civilizations. Now, there's no way around it. This either comes down to giving hot takes and opinions that go against community consensus, or you can try to approach it with stats, as I will in this video, though saying that it's admittedly difficult to always be sure they're getting at the right thing. This is using stats in a way you probably shouldn't, and underrated may not end up being quite the right word for it, which we'll talk about in a case-by-case basis, but it's still an interesting enough topic to at least play around with for entertainment's sake, if nothing else, and just see what comes out. So with that in mind, the question is then, what would the statistics of an underrated or overrated civ look like? I'll start with a general observation that stronger civilizations, or at least civs people think are strong, are picked more often in ranked games. You'd be correct in pointing out that that's not always the case though, and lots of people have favorite civs they enjoy playing while knowing they aren't top picks. I often play games with Japanese, for example, not because I think they're objectively the best civ, but because they fit my playstyle and I have the most fun with them. Something important to note though is that most players don't stick to a single civilization. If you look at people's favorite civ, which we'll define as the one they play the most often, only 9% of players in the last month were true one civ pickers, who used the same one over 90% of the time. In fact, for the majority of players, they pick their quote favorite civilization less than 30% of the time. That feels pretty intuitive to me, as I think it's fairly common to have 3 to 5 civs that you're most comfortable playing on any given map. Now, which particular civilizations you include in your pool is going to be influenced by many factors, but overall there is a strong tendency for the player base to prefer what are perceived of as strong civilizations in ranked games. Here the x-axis is the different civs win rates in 1v1 Arabia for 1200 elo and above over the last month, and the y-axis reflects how often they're picked. As you move to the right and get to stronger performing civilizations, there's a clear uptick in popularity. Franks are by far the #1 pick in 1v1 games, arguably it seems for good reason. From this sort of data, you can use some techniques to create a model that predicts based on a civ's popularity how well we'd expect it to perform, and then look for the biggest outliers. I approached Coolio9876 and he's done that analysis through his website, and though I don't want to get too bogged down in the exact methodology, it's just one way to combine all of the win rate and popularity info and identify civs that don't fit the trend. This is using 1200 elo and above 1v1 games on open maps, so anything we find will mostly apply to 1200 to 1500 rated players, who make up more than half the data, and will be less relevant to you the further you are from that range. Given this is a bit of a sketchy way to use stats and makes a lot of strong assumptions about why people are picking the civs they are, we'll treat these more as candidates for being underrated and not as mathematical proof that they are. So now that you know where the list entries are coming from, let's go through the 5 biggest outliers and see what we find. Starting off, our number 5 candidate for underrated is the Celts, though it really could have been Berbers or Huns, as all 3 scored very similarly. By performance, Celts have been the 7th best civ in 1v1 open maps recently, but only the 17th most popular pick. Celt Siege is certainly well known and popular on closed maps, but for Arabia, I think you could make the argument Celts are being underrated or underpicked. My speculation is that comes down to crossbows and knights being the sexy units in team games, and Celts are missing an important Castle Age tech for both of those units. Because of that lack of specialty in either archers or cavalry, they're among the least commonly picked civilizations for Team Arabia games, and players may be overgeneralizing that to think they must be a poor 1v1 choice as well, when in fact they're actually quite solid. Moving on, the 4th most underrated, according to the model, is the Slavs. Lately, their performance has been pretty average, with the 15th best win rate on Arabia, but they've been picked as often as we'd expect for a civ ranked 28th. They're actually picked even less often than Vietnamese, which in most patches end up somewhere in the bottom 10. That said, is it really fair to call Slavs underrated? In this case, I don't think so, or at least underrated doesn't quite feel like the right word, and this is an example of why it's good to be a little skeptical of some of the results. I think players generally respect the Slavs' farming bonus as being quite strong, both for knights and booming, as well as their late-game Hussar spam. They always end up in conversations around the best infantry and siege combo civs as well. Instead, what I think is going on is the civ is underpicked because they're a bit bland, and are defined by a very straightforward farming bonus of just a static plus 10%. For what they do, whether it be infantry, cavalry, or siege, there's just other more exciting civilizations that do the same things. Next up, at number 3, we have the Incas. Lately, they've been the 10th best 1v1 civ, but are picked as if they're one of the worst. Keeping in mind this could be a bit of a small sample size creating an outlier, I think Incas make for an interesting psychological case study. For quite a while, they were both loved and hated for a tower rush strategy based around their villagers being affected by blacksmith upgrades in Feudal. Last May, they were changed so that bonus only applies in Castle Age and beyond, which immediately tanked their play rate. Of course, it makes sense that players would lose some enthusiasm for a civ when their most well-known strategy is taken away. That said, the underrated label, in my opinion, definitely fits here, as Incas are winning at a higher rate than Aztecs, who themselves are often labeled as a top-tier civ. Even without their signature tower rush, Incas have Eagle Warriors, Slingers, and Kamyuks combined with some solid early and late game bonuses. Don't let the team bonus fool you, there's a lot going for this civ. In fact, if I had made this a completely subjective list off the top of my head, this probably would have been my number 1. Next up, number 2 actually establishes an interesting pattern, and it's the Teutons. By results, they're currently performing the 3rd best in 1v1 Arabia, but are picked as if they're average. This is the 3rd infantry civ with good siege that we've seen so far. Again, it makes me think that something about infantry and siege in your back pocket works better in 1v1s than people expect, though Teutons are also a potent cavalry and booming civ, and get quite a bit of recognition for that, so calling them underrated might be a stretch. All of the data here is also prior to the new infantry buffs as well, which improve Teutonic Knights and could also boost their play rate. That said, this is a civ that has long battled a reputation of being quite weak before several strong buffs over the last year, which may be a contributor to their low pick rate. I think the perception of being a slow civilization can also turn off a lot of players, both in terms of their underwhelming early economy and their relatively slow unit compositions. Statistically though, the number 1 underrated civ by a long shot, and it's not even close, is in fact the Indians. Lately, they've been tearing it up, with the best win rate over the last month, again with some elo and map restrictions, but nobody wants to play them, and they're being picked as if they're the 7th worst. In fact, they're being picked about as often as Koreans. Also, can we take a moment to appreciate how 3 out of the top 5 civs on an underrated list are fittingly from an expansion called The Forgotten. Given their low pick rate, the Indians' excellent results might seem like a fluke, but I think you could make the argument they are underrated, and they've been sneaking into the 1v1 Arabia top 10 for a while now, a bit under the radar. Their bonuses are solid with discounted villagers, extra pierce armor on their cavalry, with great camels and gunpowder as options as well. I think a lot of people may be turned off by the lack of knights, but with Franks, Magyars, and other cavalry civilizations being so popular these days, I could see some metagaming going on here in the Indians' favor. Also, in case you're wondering, for my sake, it turns out Japanese appear slightly overrated. But now let's get truly controversial. We have to go there. What are the most overrated civilizations? Again, maybe the term overrated is framing it too strongly, and this is a very sketchy way to interpret the stats, but at the rate these civs are being picked, we'd expect them to be performing a lot better than they are. We'll think of these as candidates for being overrated in intermediate games, and if you like one of these civs, I certainly wouldn't stop playing it just because of this video. So with that, let's do the top 3. Number 3, I actually knew even before seeing the stats that they'd be here, and it's the Chinese. They're picked as if they're a top 15 civilization, but have been ranking 28th out of 39 civs in their results. This is a special case, and it's been very well documented that Chinese are basically a bottom tier civ for players until around 1600 rating and above, after which they switch to being one of the best. I even have an entire video a couple of years back talking with the expert player Tato about why this might be. I suspect the popularity reflects a lot of expert players in tier lists and tournament interviews saying Chinese are one of the best civs in the context of high-level games, and viewers are trying to take that information back to their own intermediate-level games, where it just doesn't translate. Chinese have a tricky start, with extra villagers and no food, and while theoretically they should end up ahead, of course it doesn't always work out that way in practice for intermediate players. Their other major strength is in their flexibility, and as Tato said in our conversation, they can do pretty much anything. But again, that's something that's probably utilized best at the highest levels of play. Whether or not you want to interpret that as meaning they're overrated depends on your perspective and really why you're picking them. Next up at number 2 is the Malay. The stats say they're being picked too often, but this is more the story of a civilization that's just tanking the last month. And in fact, in the last year, they seem to do steadily worse with each new patch. It really speaks volumes that they're being flagged as statistically overplayed while also being the second least popular pick. At the same time, it feels a bit odd, as they seem pretty good on paper, with their faster advance leading to a villager advantage. And you might think it's just new players being thrown off by having it mess with their build orders, similar to Chinese. In this case though, there isn't a strong indication they even get better at higher elo ratings, and it just seems they're a tough civ for everyone to play. But finally, let's look at the number 1 overrated civ, which was actually a bit of a surprise for me. It turns out the greatest statistical anomaly is the Saracens. In this case, I think there's probably a lot of people out there who would in fact argue they're underrated, but let's see the numbers. By win rate, they're 35th out of 39, so bottom 5, but are picked as if they're 22nd, or about average. The first thing that jumps out to me is how interesting it is that Indians were the most underrated and another camel civ is the most overrated, or at least picked more often than their win rate alone should justify. I suspect this is a case of a civilization that's fun to play though, and people pick fully realizing it's going to be an uphill battle. The market bonus lends itself to a lot of creative strategies, the archer bonus against buildings seems like it has some surprise potential, and Saracens have among the most open tech trees, including Arbalaster and tons of siege options, so it's appealing to try to make them work. At the same time, I'm not sure too many people would argue Saracens are a great civilization though, so overrated again may not be exactly the right term here. So either way, that's my attempt to spot over and underplayed civilizations using stats. Hopefully you found some of the results interesting, though like I said, this is more of a conversation starter than an exact science, so I wouldn't go changing anything you do based on the results. Big thanks to Coolio9876, and I'll post a link to his site so you can check out where your favorite civilization lands if it didn't appear on the list. That's all for this one though, thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.